Welcome to Chilham, surely one of the prettiest places in Kent. Whether or not you're familiar with this place, it is after all often photographed and filmed. It's our intention today to show you some aspects of Chilham with which you may not already be familiar. People look at these buildings and they wonder at their appearance and the fact that they seem to have been unchanged for hundreds of years. But if you look at the records and old photographs, you can see that many of them have a very different appearance from what they had even 80, 90 years ago. In fact, several of them have been altered within living memory. Take this picture, for example. It supposedly shows the square as it was in the mid-19th century. You can see a fellow there in the middle of the square with a top hat, standing beside a lady with a crinoline. And then at the back you can see next to the White Horse public house a stagecoach. But there's a major anachronism in the picture. If you look very carefully, you can see just there in the churchyard the war memorial that was put here in 1920. And then beside it you can see the white cottage, whose appearance in the mid-19th century was altogether different. Here we see the cottage as it was about 1863 until the early 1920s. This scene shows the same building as it was before 1863, and it gives you a taste of the changes in this square over the last 150 years or so. Here, at the opposite corner of the square, we have pictures showing the scene as it was around 1860. Two paintings by Emily Wildman, who lived at the castle at the time, showing the cottage known as Laundry Cottage, with the one adjoining on the right, which was for the local midwife. They were pulled down long ago, and this is the scene today. Believe it or not, until 1830, this was the main road between Canterbury and Maidstone. We shall come back to that later on. On the opposite side of the square, facing the old Maidstone Road, we have this building. Look very carefully at the buildings and the quaint entrance door with its shaped timbers. You might think that had looked much as it does now since the 14th century. But here's a picture of the building as it was in the 1860s. You can see that it's white, painted white to make it look like stucco, because the owner couldn't afford or didn't want to spend the money on putting real stucco, so he painted the timbering to make it look this way. The changes to this building underline the point. 100 years ago it was known as Kennet's and looked rather like this. You will see there were twin gables and a brick front wall. Nowadays it's divided into two. The part with the bay window and the oriel above is known as Tudor Cottage, and the other one is known as the Smithy. These changes were carried out in the 1920s by Sir Edmund Davis, the wealthy mining magnate who owned the Chilham estate at that time. A genuinely kind man, Sir Edmund is still remembered for his generosity as Squire of Chilham, although he died over 70 years ago. Back across the square we have the building known as Nola's, named after a chap who lived here long ago. Again, the same story. You would think it had looked like this forever, but in fact this appearance was given to the building in the 1920s. You'll see that over the door we've got an oriel bay window with angular bays below. And here, by comparison, is the building as it looked in the mid-19th century. In those days it was known as the White House, and you can see why. They had painted the whole of the front elevation white to make it look like stucco, the same treatment as they gave to the building opposite, which we examined just now. Here they've got a little more money and they've coated the front wall in brick. But on the other hand, at the side, they haven't bothered to spend the money and they've left it timber framed as it was originally. It's not by chance that the war memorial is in this location. It stands in full view of the castle and of the front door. And I believe that this was intended to tie in with an axis running from the front door of the castle straight to the church building, about which I'll make reference later on. And so naturally, on the other side of the square, we have the entrance lodges to the castle. The ones we see today were erected in the 1920s. The designer was Sir Herbert Baker, a Kentish man who was a very prominent architect in his day. He worked with Edwin Lutyens on the rebuilding of New Delhi. 100 years ago, a very different building stood here. This entrance lodge was erected for Charles Hardy, an ironmaster from Bradford. Hardy owned the castle between 1861 and his death in 1867. He employed the architect David Brandon, whose changes to Chilham Castle have generated fierce criticism. Many people would have been quite pleased when this toy fort disappeared. And then 200 years ago, the scene looked rather like this. You can see the twin lodges either side of the drive in neo-Gothic style. Right, so let's go inside. In choosing where to locate their gate lodges, the Georgians intruded somewhat into the square, and subsequent gate lodges have occupied the same site. Previously, the gate used to stand several paces inside the present perimeter of the park. Over there, at the edge of the grass. Just a simple gate flanked by walling. And we also believe that the medieval gate used to stand here, but we don't know what it looked like. The medieval gate, of course, gave access to the medieval castle, which used to stand over here. The medieval bailey extended for about 8 acres in this direction. The only part of the medieval castle which remains now is the keep, which stands behind the trees over there. This was built in the 1170s, in the days of King Henry II. Everything else was demolished and taken away in the 16th century, when the owner of the time, Sir Thomas Cheney, also owned Shurland Hall on the Isle of Sheppey, and he shipped all the stones away from Chilham over to there. So where over here you now see an expanse of green, the bailey once upon a time had several buildings. In the foreground, over to the left, for example, stood the old stables. They were taken away about 200 years ago because obviously they were in the wrong place. In this part of Kent, the prevailing wind comes from the northeast, heading straight over the stable yard to the front of the house. Not a good arrangement. We may be sure that on such days the windows were kept shut. Yet this inconvenience was tolerated for 200 years. The engraving by the Buck brothers, produced in 1741, shows the old stables and the first lime avenue which used to lead from the gate to the castle forecourt. Thomas Heron, who owned Chilham between 1774 and 1794, felled this avenue, thus exposing the old stables and spoiling the front of the house. Heron sought advice from the great landscape gardener Lancelot Brown from Northumberland, known generally as Capability Brown. It is said that Brown acquired this nickname because, on examining a landscape, he was prone to remark that it had great capability. Amongst his recommendations for Chilham was a big oval drive around this area, but the old stables were in the way. Heron couldn't afford to pull them down and build new ones, so they had to make improvisations. The result was the Lollipop Drive, which is shown on this ordnance survey of the time. You can see the old stables there, like a big black capital F.